Okay, so this video is going to be a bit different from my last video, which was about the 14.1 patch and was focused more around gameplay, design, kind of what we were looking to get, what our goals were, that kind of stuff. This video is going to be a little more technical, and it's going to be talking about a set of changes that, as of right now, I'm making this video on the day, for most regions, the day that 14.3 goes live. About some tether changes that I have on the PB right now. And there will be a few more deploys, I believe, until all of the changes are on the PB and probably a couple more bugs to fix. Mostly, there's like two primary reasons I'm making this video. Number one, if you happen to be playing on the PB and playing any of the tether champions, basically all of these champions except not Malzahar, because I haven't changed his tether at all, because it's not range limited. I'll get into that later. Please let me know if you see anything that feels wrong. If you have a recording of like, hey, I did this with a tether and it didn't, my expectations were violated. Please send me a message on Twitter or Reddit or something like that and let me know. To be clear, these tether changes are not guaranteed to be going live in 14.4. That's the current goal, but they might get delayed if something goes wrong. And so 14.5 is a distinct possibility. Might even be later or potentially not at all, if something goes really wrong, but hopefully 14.4. The other reason to make this video is mostly just, hey, some of this stuff is interesting for some people, and so some people want to hear about tech stuff. Some people want to hear about like kind of the crossover of tech and gameplay, and so that's what this is going to be about. So what am I doing with tethers? The short version is that every tether currently in the game, with the exception of Atrox's W, uses the same method to break the tether when the range is exceeded, which is to say that they check every some number of server frames. For example, most of them are 4 times a second. So since League's servers are 30 FPS, this means every 7 or 8 frames that you will check with a tether to see if the range is being exceeded. This is live, not the new version. So this means that, say, for example, with Nocturne's E, the way that live tethers work and the way that Nocturne's tether has always worked, you can actually be out of range of Nocturne's tether for almost an entire quarter of a second without breaking the tether potentially. Now, it might be the case that you flash out of his tether and then that very next server frame checks the distance and says, you're out, boom, break the tether. But this is obviously not ideal, right? This means this is what creates the gameplay. Some people might have noticed this, especially if you play a lot of Nocturne, where you ulta onto someone as Nocturne, you press E on them, and they flash away out of the tether range. If you're Nocturne and you flash after them very quickly, sometimes the tether doesn't break. In fact, most of the time, if you flash very quickly after them, the tether won't break, even if they were outside of the range, because the update cadence just isn't that frequent. Some of these update cadences were much more frequent, and so you didn't see this kind of thing very much with, like, say, LeBlanc's tether. It used to be the case that could happen, but someone at some point, years ago, updated the update cadence on LeBlanc's tether, so it checks much more frequently on live. But what I've done is completely replaced this with I'm going to say newer tech. It's not really new at this point. It's like, I don't know, many years old, but it's just newer tech that people hadn't updated tethers to use, which, instead of checking the tether every X number of frames, instead it uses essentially what we call an area trigger, so that essentially we have a way to trigger an event whenever this range is exceeded. It's a little bit more complicated than I'm making it sound. There's a reason why no one did this 5 years ago, and so this was a meaningful amount of work for me to do, and I did this on basically my own free time that I had available. No one told me to do this, and the reason why I did this is because this is the way that tethers, people expect tethers to work. You get out of the range, you break the tether, right? And so this is a nerf to these champions generally. There are other changes that are going in here, so it's not strictly nerfs to every single one of these champions. But generally, this is going to be a very, very light nerf to, like, Nocturne, for example, because this means anytime someone gets out of your tether, it will always break. Whereas previously, there were situations where if someone only got out of your tether for 1 or 2 frames, it was actually pretty unlikely the tether would break. Because, again, it was only being checked every 7 or 8 frames for Nocturne E specifically. Again, every tether had its own update cadence. Most of them were 4 checks a second, which is 7 or 8 frames. Some of them were more frequent. But essentially what I'm trying to do here is just make tethers work the way that players expect them to work. And if we need to compensation buff these champions, I think that's totally fine. We'll be watching them closely and we'll follow up. Assuming that we ship this, again, probably but not guaranteed to be in 14.4, we will be in a position where we can monitor them. If any champion is meaningfully impacted by this, we can look to buff them. In some cases, that would probably be tether range. For example, I think Nocturne. If Nocturne went down like 1% if we ship this change, for example, that would be a situation where I might look at him and say, actually, maybe the tether range should just be 15 or 20 units higher, so it's a little bit easier to keep people in your tether, since the higher consistency means that your tether's just not going off enough. But this would be on a case-by-case basis, right? Not every champion we would treat the same. So, we'd look at things differently. So, that's sort of the kind of general thrust of things, of like, yes, I have rescripted all of these tethers with the exception of Atrox's Infernal Change, which already used this system, but I will talk about some changes I've made anyway. And Kled's Bear Trap on a Rope, that's Kled Q. I have not updated to use this system. I'll talk about that when I get to Kled. But yeah, the sort of general guidelines of this, or I guess guidelines is probably not the right word. The general sort of theme of this is I'm making tethers work the way that players expect them to work, and that means that whatever costs we have to pay for that, we'll pay them. Additionally, this is just a cleaner, nicer way of doing the tethers, right? Like the fact that we're running a bunch of math and logic, a bunch of times per second for every tether that we don't really have to run did kind of bother me also. And so this actually is a more efficient way of doing it server-wise. Although, of course, none of these abilities were particularly, intensive on particularly costly. Like this was not like some cost-saving measure that I did, for server cost reasons. Is mostly for gameplay reasons, because the gameplay of the tethers much more closely matches what players expect when the tether breaks instantly when you get out of range, rather than sometimes breaks, after some amount of time after you get outside of the range of the tether. So I'm just going to go through each individual champion and talk about any specifics on this ability, any special cases here, or any specific things that I think might be interesting or compelling for people to know, and then I'll call the video, and that'll be it. So talking about Atrox W, starting out with this one. So this one, as I mentioned, was the only tether that was actually previously using the area trigger system. However, it has a notable flaw. A lot of people are probably imagining, oh, but what about that thing with Atrox W where sometimes you would get out of it at the last instant and it would still pull you back in? So it was using the area trigger system, but it wasn't properly implemented the first time. And for whatever reason, no one had bothered to do a deeper investigation of this, of like why exactly this effect occurred, where in the last roughly quarter second, there's some variance based on server cleanup. Some complicated stuff I won't get into, but for the last roughly quarter second of Atrox's W, if you got outside the range, there was a chance you would still get pulled in to the center at the very end. The spell worked perfectly. Basically, if you got outside of the range at any point before the last quarter second, and again, based on random variance, sometimes you could get out even within a quarter second of the end and it would still work correctly and not pull you back in. However, because the essentially area trigger was controlled by a separate buff than the pull, what was happening was that when the area trigger and the buff were expiring on the same frame, sometimes, towards the end of their lifetime, the area trigger would try and send the message, like essentially send the message or trigger the logic that would say, hey, don't pull this person. They're out of the area. Because of the way the server handles cleaning up buffs and things like this, sometimes there was an issue where the cleanup, the cleanup would cause a action queuing such that the logic wouldn't kind of get transmitted to the pulling buff in time, and it would just say like, yeah, I'm already expiring, and the expiration of the buff, was what triggered the pull. And so what that meant was sometimes the message, essentially the like logic, the message of the hey, don't pull this person from the area trigger buff was too late to make it to the pull buff. And there, for good reasons, I've actually unified these buffs in the cases of the other tethers so that these exist in the same buff so that we don't have this problem. But in the case of Atrox W, I didn't fully rescript it, and so you may notice if you play a frame by frame, like if you get Atrox W'd, you record that, you look at your buff bar, and you play a frame by frame version of it. You might notice one of the buffs actually lasts an extra frame duration, which was sort of like the easy hacky solution to that problem. There's a little bit more going on underneath the surface. Again, I'm kind of oversimplifying this for the sake of the video, but extending that buff duration slightly to make sure that the area trigger buff always lasts longer, and adding an additional logic check onto the pull to make sure that you have not exited the area. I believe that I fixed this bug that can cause you to get pulled back into Atrox W even though you were out of the area. So again, if anyone notices this happening on the PB from this video forward, or on live, if these changes do end up going live, please let me know, because as far as I'm aware, I was unable to replicate this, on myself. Getting pulled back into the Atrox W at the last, in the last couple of frames. And so if you can, please let me know, and I can take another look at it. It might be worth doing some deeper work here. But again, Atrox W was already using the area trigger method, and so it's actually changed. Aside from that one bug fix, it's really changed less than most of these other spells. Fiddlesticks W is another one that's kind of interesting. Fiddlesticks doesn't move, which makes it so that I don't think, in some ways, this one is less impacted because Fiddlesticks doesn't move, and so he was already kind of a stationary target, and so mostly what you're getting out of this is you're going to take slightly less damage from Fiddlesticks W on average, which has led to me considering buffing the range on the tether slightly. We were just doing some testing today on this in some internal playtests, and so it's possible that over the PB, like the next couple of PB cycles, you might see me buff this value on the range slightly, because this tether is unique in that it deals damage over time, and it's Fiddlesticks' primary damage spell, and so by making the tether more consistent, I have actually just kind of nerfed Fiddlesticks' damage very slightly, because you'll average slightly fewer ticks of Fiddlesticks W damage. And so I'm going to consider raising the range on this tether a little bit. You might see that on the PB at some point, but not a guaranteed thing. I'm going to be doing some more exploration and seeing if I can get some like damage comparisons and see like, hey, is this actually meaningful? And do we want to actually mess with this number any? Because of course that has a real meaningful impact on Fiddlesticks, right? It is a his primary damage spell, so I would want to make sure that we're not just like randomly, buffing him for no reason, just in the same way that I want to be confident that we're not randomly nerfing him for no reason. But the consistency here, we do value, like making this spell, conform to player expectations. And so, we'll see how that goes. Alawi's E, this is specifically the tether from the spirit that she pulls out of the body to the person that like affects you with the vessel debuff. If you break the tether. This means that breaking the tether will be more responsive. It'll be actually easier to get out of, or very slightly easier, more consistent to get out of the Alawi E tether zone. I don't really expect this to be a meaningful change. Yes, on average you'll get out slightly faster. And so, maybe this has some impact on Alawi, but I kind of doubt it. A lot of the time, the gameplay around getting out of the tether range, a couple of frames here and there, I think, are unlikely to make a super significant difference for Alawi, but I could always be wrong. But I suspect this one probably won't be a huge impact. Karma W is another one that might, have a real impact here, because of course Karma does have a cast time on her W, and so it's possible that there will be more situations where Karma is casting her W, and you're able to like use a self haste or speed of some kind to get out of the range. It'll be more consistent, easier to get out of the range of Karma's W before Karma can kind of catch up to you with her Eve movement speed and that kind of thing. But there's nothing super special about Karma W, and so there's not really too much to talk about here. This one just received the same change as everything else, where it should just be more responsive. Kled's Q is the one spell in this that does not use the new area trigger new area trigger script. The reason why I didn't update it is because Kled's Q is sort of unique as a tether, where it shrinks the range over time. where when you start Kled queuing someone, the allowable tether range is really, really big. And so there just wasn't really much point because the way that it's currently scripted is a little different than the other tethers already, and it already kind of accounts for the fact that the range is lowering over time, and so spawning a bunch of different area triggers doesn't really give us much meaningful improvement on the method that it's already currently using. And so the only change I made here was actually to increase the number of checks per second that this spell does. Previously it was I believe it was 4 checks per second on the tether. Now it will be checking 20 times per second, or something around there. I don't remember the exact numbers. But essentially, Kled queue, if you are out of the range, there should be a maximum of 1 frame where it doesn't check if you're out of the range. I wish that we had a better system for a shrinking tether, but that would mean we would need a way to have like a constantly like live updating linear area trigger, tech that we just don't have because there's not really much need for it. The version that's in will be much more responsive. You should really be able to snap Kled's Q tether. If you're truly out of range, it should be more plausible to get out of Kled's Q tether range. It should be more plausible to actually snap the tether, because it will update more frequently. Which means that there will be fewer situations where you like get out of the range, but Kled is like E-ing at you or something like that, or running at you with his E movement speed buff, or whatever the case might be. Again, this is one where I suspect that it's probably marginal enough that it probably doesn't have a huge impact, but again, I could totally be wrong. And it's possible that making this much more responsive will have some meaningful impact on Kled, but I don't really expect it to. Sorry. LeBlanc is kind of an interesting case because LeBlanc's E and her RE already had a number of special rules on them, some of which I tried to preserve as best I could because I think they're worth preserving. The main one I preserved is that on live, there is a grace period of 0.25 seconds on LeBlanc's E where the tether could not possibly break. I suspect, this isn't noted anywhere in the script, but I suspect the reason for this is that if you don't have that grace period, which I did try, by the way, in a test, if you don't have that 0.25 second grace period, it's actually kind of hard to tell if you say, like, if you W forward on LeBlanc, you fire your E, and you snap back to your W, and then the E hits someone, it's actually kind of hard to tell what happened. They just, like, take some magic damage, and the tether just instantaneously disappears. And it's kind of hard to grok, like, wait, what just happened? Particularly when that person has your Q mark on them, it can be hard to tell like what actually happened in a team fight type, high action scenario. It's hard to attribute because we use hit effects on most of our spells these days. Even older spells generally have some kind of hit effect to tell you, hey, this spell has hit you. But LeBlanc doesn't have one, presumably because it has this tether and because it has this grace period, right? And so the grace period effectively is the hit effect where it's like, hey, look, there's this gigantic tether attached to you to tell you got hit by LeBlanc, and to also tell the LeBlanc, hey, by the way, you hit this tether. Even if it's going to break after a quarter second of the tether being attached there does tell you, hey, you hit the spell, right? And so you can kind of understand that that's what happened. So I left that grace period in. It works a little, like very slightly differently than the previous one, but for all intents and purposes, you really shouldn't notice a difference as a LeBlanc player because LeBlanc's tether was already checking the distance 20 times per second, which means most server frames it was checking the distance anyway. And so the differences in terms of gameplay on LeBlanc should be pretty minor. I will note one thing on the PB that I'm aware of right now that I still have to fix is that visually, if you kill someone with the tether attached in the first 0.25 seconds, you will still have a tether attached to their body until the grace period is over, which is kind of funny. But that's a bug that I'm looking to resolve in the near future. So hopefully I'll have a fix for that on the PB in the next or maybe 2 deploys from now or something like that. So we'll see. But yeah, that's a bug I am aware of. Don't send that one to me unless there's something else going on. That one I'm already looking at. But yeah, for the most part, again, LeBlanc probably won't feel that different because I've tried to preserve all of the kind of edge cases and like special things that were already going on with LeBlanc's tether. And it was already one of the tethers that was checking very frequently, and so the gameplay probably won't change that much. Malzahar's Nether Grasp, I didn't actually change anything about this spell because it's not range limited as far as I know, so I don't think there's any reason to do this. Also, Malzahar is effectively self-rooted and the target is suppressed, so there's not really any reason to mess with the tether logic here. It doesn't really need to be different. Nocturne's E, as I mentioned a few times, this is one of the tethers that'll be more impacted because Nocturne is a melee champion that moves, and the tether is actually very low range, and so it was actually pretty breakable, especially with flash. This is one of the champions that might need a slight bump in tether range. We'll continue to do some more internal testing on this, but we'll see if this actually matters much, especially if we ever go live with this stuff. Not too much to say there. Mostly basic changes here. Morgana, similar. So one thing to note here is that Morgana's a little bit more complicated because her ultimate gives her movement speed. That movement speed will now persist for a very short amount of time after there are no tethers attached to her, potentially up to 0.25 seconds. But that's sort of a consequence of just like the way that League handles buffs and things like that. You won't actually lose the movement speed sooner than you would before, and so Morgana really hasn't changed that much. It's just that the tether will be, again, just more responsive. You'll be able to see people getting out of the tether, a little bit sooner than they would have otherwise. I suspect the gameplay here isn't that different. Renata Q, this one I think is like, there's almost no way for this to be different because the tether range on Renata is 1200. It's like actually very hard to break this tether range on Renata because she's kind of slow, and you usually just use your Q instead of like getting close to the tether range. But like theoretically, the only way I can imagine this being relevant on Renata right now is like theoretically on live, you could like Renata Q while the projectile is in the air, you could get Tristana ulted slightly outside the range of your handshake, and then you could like flash back in, I guess. So like this has maybe happened on live a couple of times, I imagine, right? It's like really hard for me to construct a scenario where changing the tether update cadence on Renata matters at all. But I updated it for, just good coding practices sake. I don't think this one will matter because it's just so hard to break this tether because, again, it's not very long duration. Renata normally just reactivates Q2, which ends the tether anyway. And the range is so big, it's 1200, and the person who has the Q on them can't move. They're rooted, right? So it's like the situations in which you would have to have happen to make this tether range matter, or like this like tether update rate matter, like are so like outrageous to me, like so like unthinkable that I just can't imagine this matters. Anyway, Zac Q. This is the one that's the spell that's changed the most because Zac Q was previously center to center checks, which is very weird because the spell itself uses a boundary check, right? Like actually hitting someone with a Q checks their boundary. And so, because, just to make this more standard alongside all of these other tethers, which use boundary checks, basically saying like you check the edge of the champion and not the center of the champion, to keep up with the standards of all of the other tethers and also the actual spell itself, which I didn't, the actual Q, Zac Q, like throwing his fist at you spell, this now uses a boundary check. Because of that, some data miners have noticed that I lowered the range on Zac's Q tether range from 1000 to 900. This should mostly be equivalent for most purposes. And then I've done one other thing for Zac, which is the self tether ring on Zac Q that tells you how far away you can move before the tether breaks. I've actually enlarged it by about 25% because one of the things I noticed when I was messing around with this, while I was like rescripting all of these and locally testing them all, is that the self tether ring, for whatever reason, on Zac was just very inaccurate. Like it showed you a much lower range than you could actually, walk around in and like not break the tether. The weird thing is that the enemy tether range was pretty accurate. It was like pretty much bang on, like exactly where you would expect, like exactly where you would walk out and break it. But the self tether range was just not true. You could actually walk like on live. You can check this yourself right now if you're watching this video. You can go play Zac on live. Cue something and then like see how far it takes you walking outside your tether, like the green ring that appears, to actually break the tether. It's like a couple of units outside, a couple hundred units outside the green tether, which I found to be really bizarre. So I made the tether ring more accurate. So you should have an easier time kind of understanding where that tether range actually is if you're playing Zac. And this should mostly just match expectations, right? Again, all other tethers use the boundary system for good reason, which is that players, when they're, gameplay wise, sure, center, edge, both are fine, things for different types of applications. But for tethers, because there's like an edge boundary that kind of just like very cleanly displays itself to the players, the way that it reads in the moment is usually that boundary checks are better because you don't look at that and say, I'm a gigantic Cho'Gath. My center point crossing this means, or like I'm playing against a giant Cho'Gath. The center point of Cho'Gath crossing my boundary means that he should break the tether. It's like, you look at the Cho'Gath and you say, wait, but the Cho'Gath is huge. He's still in my tether. Like, look at this gigantic, piece of Cho'Gath that's in my tether range. Why is the tether breaking? And so this should hopefully be more intuitive and more straightforward for the purposes, just basically the way that the tethers are visualized with the like edge boundary that we have. If you think of like when you get Karma W'd, you can see that little curve that says like, hey, if you get out of this range, then you break the tether. Boundary checks just more match with the way that I think people look at these tethers, and so that's why I changed Zac Q. This is not, again, the Zac changes specifically are not intended to be like a buff or a nerf. Just in general, these changes are not intended to be buffs or nerfs. They're just intended to make the gameplay correct. In general, in most cases, right, these are going to probably be a very, very light, most likely, I think, imperceptible nerf. And again, we will keep an eye on these champions, and when we ship these changes, we will be watching these champions closely. If they need a buff, we'll be happy to do that. So hopefully that covers everything as far as tethers go, and hopefully this is a educational, useful video for people, or at least interesting. I don't know if it'll be useful, but yeah, hopefully this is cool content for people. And yeah, to kind of summarize, I guess I'll just kind of at the end of the video here, kind of just summarize my thoughts in case I wasn't clear earlier in the video, which I probably wasn't because I didn't really put together a script for this or anything. But yeah, the summary is basically tethers currently on live 14.3 use a very, very basic kind of slow tick rate based system to update whether the tether should break or not, right? And so they only check every so often. I have updated these to use a new system, which uses an area trigger, which basically says, hey, whenever the person with the tether gets out of the tether range, run this logic, which means it'll happen instantaneously when they leave the area instead of, variable time based on, what server ticket, you happen to be on, and other, server nonsense stuff that's going on. Some other champions have received further changes, and I've done a little bit of cleanup on some miscellaneous bugs, like, for example, the Atrox W pulling you at the last second, even though you got out of the W. I've cleaned up a few things like that, and made some adjustments to Zac to make his tether, not only his VFX, but the actual tech of his, or actually the actual way that his tether works, to hopefully make it better match the way that players view these tethers. So I think that hopefully is a good summary that covers everything, and I think that's it. Thanks for watching, and catch you on the next video whenever that is.